The message arrived just after sunrise, while Margaret Collins was pouring herself a second cup of coffee. She glanced at her phone, expecting a reminder from the pharmacy, or perhaps a note from one of her old coworkers. Instead, she found a text from her daughter-in-law, Olivia Parker. "Margaret, we've decided to keep this year's family gathering very small. It'll just be Daniel, the kids, and me. We figured you'd enjoy a quiet weekend at home instead. Hope you understand." Margaret stared at the screen for several seconds before setting the phone face down on the kitchen table. At 65, she'd learned not to waste tears on people who had already made up their minds. Life had taught her that disappointment wasn't always loud. Sometimes it arrived quietly, wrapped in polite words that hid far uglier intentions. Outside her dining room window, the maple trees swayed gently in the autumn breeze. The house had been her sanctuary for more than 30 years. Every room carried memories of birthdays, Christmas mornings, and evenings spent laughing with her late husband, Richard. Since Richard's passing nearly 4 years earlier, however, the atmosphere had slowly changed, not inside the house, inside the family. Olivia had gradually become the decision-maker in every conversation. Her son, Daniel, once confident and thoughtful, rarely expressed an opinion anymore. Whenever Olivia spoke, Daniel simply nodded along, avoiding conflict at any cost. Margaret had noticed the pattern long before anyone else admitted it. She wasn't angry about missing one gathering. She was hurt by what the invitation, or rather, the lack of one, actually meant. She had helped make their comfortable life possible. Years earlier, when Daniel and Olivia struggled to qualify for their mortgage, Margaret quietly stepped in. She contributed a large portion of the down payment from her retirement savings, and later continued helping with insurance bills, home maintenance, unexpected repairs, and countless temporary emergencies. Temporary had somehow turned into permanent. Every month money left her account without hesitation. Every month gratitude became a little smaller. Now she wasn't even considered important enough to share dinner with. Margaret walked into her study and unlocked a tall oak filing cabinet. She pulled out a thick blue folder labeled Family Expenses. Unlike most people, she never relied on memory, she relied on numbers. Page after page documented every transfer she'd made during the past 8 years. Mortgage assistance, property taxes, roof repairs, school tuition, medical bills. Even expensive patio furniture, Olivia insisted, was essential for entertaining clients. Margaret slowly added the totals. The final figure made her shake her head. Over $50,000, money she'd never expected back. Money she'd gladly given because she believed family supported one another. She closed the folder. Something shifted inside her, not anger, clarity. If she had become unnecessary as family, perhaps it was time to become unnecessary as their financial safety net as well. An hour later, Margaret parked outside the community bank she'd used for nearly 40 years. The branch manager, Linda Brooks, greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Margaret. What can I do for you today?" "I'd like to stop every automatic transfer connected to Daniel's household." Linda looked surprised. "All of them?" Margaret smiled politely. "Every single one." Within 20 minutes, every recurring payment was canceled: maintenance fund, insurance contributions, mortgage assistance, lawn service, even the quarterly property tax transfers. Linda hesitated before handing over the paperwork. "Are you certain?" "I've never been more certain." As Margaret walked back to her car, she felt strangely peaceful. She hadn't started a fight. She had simply stopped financing one. That afternoon, Daniel appeared unexpectedly at her front door. His expression carried the nervous smile of someone sent to gather information without revealing too much. "Mom." She invited him inside and poured tea. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I heard you canceled some payments." "I did. Olivia's worried something's wrong." Margaret stirred her tea slowly. "She's right." Daniel leaned forward. "What happened?" Margaret looked directly into his eyes. "For years I believed I was helping my family build a secure future." "You were no," she answered quietly. "I was funding people who no longer wanted me around." Daniel's shoulders stiffened. "Mom, the family dinner isn't personal." She almost laughed. When someone tells you there's no room for you at the family table, Daniel, it's always personal. He opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. Margaret had seen that silence before. It was the same silence that appeared whenever Olivia spoke over him. The same silence that allowed disrespect to grow year after year. She stood and walked him to the front door. I think it's time you and Olivia learn what life costs when someone else stops paying for it. Daniel frowned. You wouldn't actually leave us struggling. Margaret smiled gently. I won't make you struggle. She paused before adding, I'm simply going to let you stand on your own. As Daniel drove away, Margaret noticed him checking his phone repeatedly. No doubt Olivia was waiting for answers. She hoped they found some, because she had finally found hers. The following morning, Margaret woke earlier than usual. For the first time in years, her schedule wasn't built around solving someone else's problems. She made breakfast, watered the flowers lining her kitchen window, and sat on the back porch watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and orange. The peaceful silence reminded her of mornings she'd once shared with Richard. He had always believed generosity was a gift, but only when it was appreciated. She smiled sadly. He had also warned her never to mistake dependence for love. Back then, she hadn't understood what he meant. Now she did. 2 days passed without a single phone call. Margaret wasn't surprised. Olivia rarely reached out unless money was involved. Right on schedule, her phone rang Thursday afternoon. She answered calmly. Hello, Olivia. Her daughter-in-law's cheerful voice sounded almost rehearsed. Margaret, I just wanted to check on you. Daniel said you canceled a few bank transfers. I'm sure it's all some misunderstanding. There isn't any misunderstanding. A brief silence followed. I've decided your household expenses are no longer my responsibility. Olivia forced a nervous laugh. Oh, don't be silly. You know things have been tight lately. Margaret looked out toward her garden. I know they wouldn't have been nearly as comfortable without my help. That's unfair. No, Margaret replied. Unfair is being good enough to pay the bills, but not good enough to receive an invitation. The sweetness vanished from Olivia's voice. You really took that personally? I took it exactly the way it was intended. Another long pause. Finally, Olivia sighed dramatically. Daniel didn't want you upset. Then perhaps he should have spoken. Margaret ended the call before another excuse could follow. That evening, she opened the folder containing every legal document related to her property. Her home had been completely paid off for nearly 15 years. No mortgage, no debt, no financial obligations. Everything belonged solely to her. She remembered several conversations where Olivia casually mentioned how practical it would be if Margaret eventually downsized. You don't need such a large place. Think how wonderful it would be for the grandchildren. We could keep the house in the family. At the time, those comments had seemed harmless. Now they sounded like preparation. Margaret picked up her phone and called an old friend. Hello? Martin? It's Margaret Collins. The familiar voice immediately brightened. Margaret, it's been ages. Martin Hayes had spent over 3 decades as one of the city's most respected real estate brokers before opening his own boutique agency. I need a confidential property valuation. Thinking of selling? I'm thinking of changing my future. I'll be there tomorrow morning. Martin arrived promptly at 9, carrying a leather folder and laser measuring tools. After touring the property, he smiled. You've maintained this place beautifully. I've tried. The market is strong. How strong? He named a figure that exceeded Margaret's expectations by nearly 20%. She raised her eyebrows. I had no idea. You'd have buyers within days. Margaret walked slowly through the living room after he left. Her eyes rested on family photographs decorating the fireplace, Richard holding baby Daniel. Christmas mornings, beach vacations, graduation ceremonies, happy memories. But memories weren't trapped inside walls. She could carry them anywhere. Late Saturday afternoon, her next-door neighbor, George Walker, knocked on the door carrying a basket of fresh tomatoes from his garden. George had retired after serving nearly 30 years as a police officer. He and Margaret had watched out for one another ever since Richard passed away. You look thoughtful, George observed. I'm making some important decisions. He nodded knowingly. Need someone keeping an eye on things? I may. You've got it. She thanked him before changing the subject. There was no reason to reveal everything yet. The following week remained unusually quiet. No family visits, no invitations, no apologies. Instead, Margaret received notification after notification from the bank confirming canceled payments. Then came something she hadn't expected. A message from Daniel. Mom, can we talk? Things are getting complicated. She stared at the screen before replying. Tomorrow afternoon. 3 o'clock, exactly at 3. Daniel arrived looking exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. He sat across from her at the dining table. We're behind on several bills already. Margaret remained silent. The mortgage payment bounced. Still, she said nothing. The credit cards are nearly maxed out. Finally, she spoke. How much were you relying on my help? Daniel looked away. I didn't realize how much until it stopped. Margaret folded her hands. That's exactly why it had to stop. He rubbed his forehead. Olivia thinks you're punishing us. No, she met his eyes. I'm teaching you something I should have taught years ago. And what's that? Adults build their own security. Daniel's face tightened. You've changed. Margaret smiled gently. No, Daniel. She stood and walked toward the window. For the first time in a very long while, I'm finally becoming myself again. As Daniel drove away, Margaret noticed something unusual. A gray SUV slowed briefly in front of her house before continuing down the street. She didn't recognize it. At first, she dismissed it as coincidence. She had no idea that within days, strangers would appear at her property with measuring equipment and clipboards, setting in motion a confrontation that would change everything. 3 mornings later, Margaret was enjoying breakfast on her back patio when unfamiliar voices drifted through the quiet neighborhood. At first, she assumed a delivery truck had stopped nearby. Then she heard footsteps. She stood, walked toward the sliding glass door, and looked into her backyard. Her expression froze. Olivia was standing beside a sharply dressed man carrying a clipboard and a laser measuring device. They were slowly walking around the property, pointing toward the roof, windows, and detached garage while discussing measurements. Margaret opened the patio door. Good morning. Both of them turned immediately. Olivia forced a smile. Oh, Margaret, we didn't realize you were outside. Margaret folded her arms. I can see that. The man stepped forward politely. Good morning, ma'am. My name is Harold Benson. I'm a licensed property appraiser. I gathered that. Harold looked slightly uncomfortable. I was asked to prepare an estimated market valuation. Margaret's eyes shifted toward Olivia. Really? Olivia laughed nervously. It's nothing serious. Daniel thought it would be helpful to know the current value of your property for future planning. Future planning? Yes, estate planning. Margaret stared at her for several seconds before speaking. My estate is already planned. Olivia's smile faded. Well, we were only trying to help. By entering my property without asking? Harold quickly lowered his clipboard. I sincerely apologize, Mrs. Collins. I was under the impression permission had already been granted. It wasn't. The appraiser looked embarrassed. I'm very sorry. Margaret nodded politely. I know this isn't your fault. Then she looked directly at Olivia. But it is yours. For the first time, Olivia's confident attitude began to crack. You don't have to make such a big deal out of this. Margaret took one slow step forward. A big deal? You brought a stranger onto private property to evaluate my home without even speaking to me. Olivia crossed her arms. We're family, Margaret answered calmly. Family asks. It doesn't assume. The silence between them grew heavier. Harold quietly closed his folder. I think it's best if I leave. I agree, Margaret replied. He apologized once more before walking toward his vehicle parked along the street. Olivia remained standing near the garden. You've changed. Margaret smiled faintly. No. I've finally stopped ignoring what was always happening. Just then, George Walker noticed the conversation from across the fence while trimming his hedges. He walked over. Everything all right here, Margaret? She nodded. It is now. George looked toward Olivia. Need any assistance? Olivia immediately grabbed her purse. No. Without another word, she hurried toward her SUV, slammed the door, and sped away. George watched the vehicle disappear. What was that all about? Margaret sighed. They were measuring a house that isn't theirs. George shook his head in disbelief. Some people mistake kindness for permission. Margaret quietly replied, "They've been making that mistake for years." Later that afternoon, Margaret called Martin Hayes. "I've made my decision. The house is going on the market." Martin didn't sound surprised. "I already have several qualified buyers who'd love this neighborhood." "Keep everything discreet. Of course, no signs, no public listing. I understand." Within 48 hours, Martin arranged 3 private viewings. Every potential buyer admired the home's condition. By the end of the weekend, Margaret received 2 strong offers. She accepted one from a young married couple expecting their first child. As she signed the preliminary agreement, an unexpected feeling settled over her. Relief, not sadness, not regret, hope. For the first time since Richard died, she wasn't protecting the past. She was choosing her future. Monday evening, Daniel called again. His voice sounded strained. "Mom, Olivia said something happened at your house." "It did." "You embarrassed her." Margaret remained silent for several moments. Finally, she asked, "Did she tell you why she brought an appraiser onto my property?" Daniel hesitated. She thought, "Maybe we should know what everything was worth." "Why?" "I don't know." Margaret almost smiled. "I think you do." Daniel said nothing. His silence answered the question. She spoke gently. "Daniel, were you already discussing what would happen to my house after I was gone?" Another long pause. Finally, he whispered, "We were only talking." Margaret closed her eyes. "You were dividing a life that still belongs to me." "It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that." Her voice remained calm. "I spent decades building this home. I planted every tree. I painted every wall. I celebrated every birthday inside it. And while I'm still alive, your wife is measuring it." Daniel couldn't respond. Margaret continued softly, "I don't resent losing a house someday. I resent being treated as though I've already left this world." Tears filled Daniel's eyes. "I'm sorry." She believed he meant it, but apologies couldn't erase years of quiet acceptance. "I hope you truly understand one day." Before ending the call, Margaret added one final sentence. "Some decisions can't be undone." She hung up gently. The following morning, Martin called with exciting news. The buyers accepted every condition. The closing date is set. Margaret smiled as sunlight streamed through the kitchen window. Her future had officially begun. She just didn't realize how fiercely Olivia would react once she discovered the house had already been sold. Margaret barely slept the night after signing the purchase agreement. It wasn't because she doubted her decision. It was because she finally felt free. For years, every financial choice she made had revolved around someone else's needs. Every unexpected expense in Daniel's household somehow became her responsibility. Every holiday came with another request disguised as a favor. Now, for the first time in years, she was planning a future that belonged entirely to her. Early Monday morning, she met Martin Hayes at the title office to complete the final paperwork. The buyers, Noah and Claire Bennett, were a young couple expecting their first child. They fell in love with the house the moment they walked through the front door. "It's exactly what we've been looking for," Claire said with a bright smile. "We promise we'll take good care of it." Margaret looked around the living room one last time. "I know you will." Within an hour, the documents were signed. The sale was official. Martin handed her a copy of the completed paperwork. "Congratulations," he said warmly. "A new chapter begins today." Margaret smiled. "I think it's been waiting for me for a long time." The peace didn't last. Late that afternoon, a moving truck backed into her driveway. Margaret had hired a professional company to clear the basement storage area. For years, Daniel had used nearly half the space to store inventory for his online business without paying rent or utilities. She had reminded him several times to remove it. Nothing ever changed. This time, She had mailed him a written notice giving him 10 days. The deadline had passed. The workers carefully packed shelves, boxes, and equipment before transporting everything to a secure storage facility rented in Daniel's name. Margaret had prepaid the first month's fee. After that, the responsibility would be his. As the final boxes were being loaded, a familiar black SUV screeched to a halt outside the house. Daniel jumped out first. Olivia followed seconds later. Both looked furious. "What are they doing?" Daniel shouted. Margaret stepped onto the front porch. "They're removing property that was left here after the deadline expired." Daniel stared at the truck. "You can't just throw my business out." "I didn't." She calmly handed him a folder. "Everything has been inventoried and placed in climate-controlled storage." Daniel opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were the storage contract, payment receipt, and access information. "You paid the first month?" "I did." "After that," Margaret continued, "it's your responsibility." Olivia stormed toward the porch. "This is unbelievable." Margaret remained composed. "No. What's unbelievable is expecting free storage for years while treating me like an inconvenience." Olivia's face turned bright red. "You've become incredibly selfish." Margaret almost laughed. "For decades I gave without keeping score." She looked directly at her daughter-in-law. "Setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's healthy." Olivia pointed toward the house. "This place belongs in the family." Margaret quietly reached into her handbag. "It already has a new family." She handed Daniel another document. He read the first page. His face lost all color. "Mom," his voice barely rose above a whisper, "you sold the house?" "Yes." "When?" 3 days ago." Daniel looked completely stunned. "But this was supposed to be." He stopped speaking. Margaret finished the sentence for him. "Our inheritance?" Neither Daniel nor Olivia answered. Their silence confirmed everything. Margaret folded her hands. "You were counting on something that never belonged to you." Olivia exploded. "You had no right." Margaret's expression hardened for the first time. "I had every right. I earned this house. I paid every mortgage payment. I paid every repair. I paid every tax. I also had every legal right to sell it." Olivia opened her mouth again, but no words came out. The truth had left nothing to argue with. The moving truck pulled away. The street became quiet again. Daniel stood motionless, still staring at the paperwork. "I don't understand." Margaret stepped down from the porch. "I think you do." She spoke gently. "You stopped seeing me as your mother. You started seeing me as financial security." Daniel lowered his head. "I never meant. You didn't have to mean it," she interrupted softly. "You allowed it to happen." Tears filled his eyes. "I should have stood up for you." "Yes, I should have invited you, yes." "I should have told Olivia she was wrong." Margaret nodded. "Yes." For several moments neither of them spoke. Finally she placed a hand on his shoulder. "I still love you, Daniel, but love without respect eventually becomes painful." He quietly wiped his eyes. "I'm sorry. I hope one day you'll prove it." She walked back toward the front door. Before going inside, she turned once more. "The new owners take possession in 2 weeks. I suggest using that time wisely." Without another word, she entered the house and closed the door behind her. Standing by the living room window, Margaret watched as Daniel remained frozen in the driveway while Olivia angrily argued beside him. For the first time, he didn't answer her. He simply stood there, staring at the home that was no longer theirs to dream about. Margaret quietly drew the curtains. Some chapters didn't end with shouting, some ended with silence. And sometimes silence spoke louder than anything else. Moving day arrived beneath a crisp October sky. The trees lining Margaret's street had turned brilliant shades of amber and crimson, and a cool breeze carried fallen leaves across the driveway. She stood quietly on the front porch as the movers carried the last few boxes into the truck. She wasn't taking much. A handful of family photographs, Richard's favorite reading chair, several boxes of books, a small oak desk. Everything else would stay with the house. The memories belonged to her, not the furniture. Before locking the front door one final time, Margaret slowly walked through each room. She paused in the hallway where Daniel had taken his first steps. She smiled at the kitchen where countless holiday dinners had filled the house with laughter. Then she stepped into the backyard, looking at the maple tree Richard had planted on their 10th wedding anniversary. She gently rested her hand against its trunk. "Thank you," she whispered, not to the house, to the life she had lived there. Then she walked away without looking back. Her new home overlooked the shoreline of Lake Superior, tucked inside a peaceful lakeside community nearly 3 hours away. It wasn't large, it didn't need to be. The cozy condominium featured one spacious bedroom, a bright kitchen, and a balcony where she could watch sailboats drift across the water each evening. For the first time in years, every inch of her home reflected only her choices. No one expected anything from her. No one demanded explanations. The silence wasn't lonely, it was healing. Margaret spent her mornings walking along the shoreline, afternoons volunteering at the local community center where she helped young entrepreneurs understand budgeting and bookkeeping, and evenings reading novels with a cup of tea beside the fireplace. Life became wonderfully simple. About a month after settling in, her sister Helen came to visit. As they sat on the balcony watching the sunset, Helen smiled. "You look younger," Margaret laughed. "I feel lighter. They've been calling me." "I figured they would. Olivia still insists you overreacted." Margaret wasn't surprised. "And Daniel?" Helen looked toward the lake before answering. "He's different." "How so?" "He moved into a small apartment." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And Olivia?" "They separated." Margaret remained silent. Helen continued. "Apparently, once the financial pressure started, all the cracks in their marriage became impossible to ignore." Margaret felt no satisfaction, only sadness, not because she regretted her decision, because it had taken losing everything for Daniel to finally recognize what truly mattered. Winter arrived early that year. Snow covered the shoreline and the harbor froze into a sheet of glittering white. One afternoon, Margaret received a handwritten letter. The familiar handwriting immediately caught her attention. "Daniel," she opened it slowly. There were no requests for money, no excuses, no attempts to blame anyone else. Instead, the letter spoke honestly. He admitted that he had allowed Olivia to make decisions he should have challenged. He admitted that he had confused his mother's generosity with obligation. Most importantly, he accepted responsibility without expecting forgiveness. The final sentence stayed with Margaret long after she finished reading. "I don't expect you to trust me again soon. I only hope that one day I'll become someone worthy of earning it." Margaret folded the letter carefully. For the first time in years, she believed her son had begun to grow. Nearly 6 months later, spring returned to the lakeshore. Wildflowers bloomed along the walking trails, and the cafes once again filled with visitors. Margaret was reading on a park bench overlooking the marina when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Mom?" She turned. Daniel stood several feet away. He looked different. Not wealthier, not more successful, simply steadier. He wore inexpensive clothes, drove an older car, and carried himself with a quiet confidence she hadn't seen in years. "May I sit?" She nodded. For over an hour they talked, not about money, not about the house, not about Olivia. Instead, Daniel spoke about rebuilding his life. He had found a better job, created a realistic budget, paid off several debts, and learned to live within his means. "I never realized how dependent I'd become," he admitted. "I thought someone would always rescue me." Margaret smiled gently. "Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to rescue someone." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I understand that now." As they walked along the shoreline together, neither tried to erase the past. Some wounds needed time. Some trust had to be rebuilt one choice at a time. Before leaving, Daniel hugged his mother. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect. It was honest. "I love you, Mom." "I love you, too," Margaret replied. "But remember something." He looked at her. "Respect keeps a family together. Money never does." Daniel nodded quietly before walking back toward his car. Margaret watched him drive away until he disappeared around the bend. Then she turned toward the lake, where gentle waves shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. She had lost a house. She had lost comfort. She had even lost the family she once believed she knew. Yet, In the process, she had gained something far more valuable: her independence, her peace, and the confidence to protect both. Sometimes, the strongest foundation isn't the one beneath a house, it's the one you finally build within yourself.